Right, well, Bob, thanks for joining us. And so you're heading a panel looking at the long-term, or helping Treasury look at the long-term fiscal projections. So just give us an overview of exactly what you're looking at, what you've been asked to do, and why Treasury thinks this is needed.
Yeah, okay, Alex. Well, as you're aware, there is a statutory obligation that the Treasury has to evaluate at least every 4 years the long-term fiscal outlook, and to the best of their ability they are to assess what the outlook looks like over the next 40 years and what are the sort of pressures and challenges that governments will be faced in achieving sustainable fiscal policies over the next 40 years. So that's the obligation on the Treasury, and the Treasury have already produced 2 reports, one in 2006, one in 2009. They felt in light of that experience they'd like to try a different approach in their preparation to that report. The external panel is there to provide, was set up by Treasury to provide them with an opportunity of approaching this rather differently.
Okay, and so it's sort of being approached like the tax working group was approached. So you've got different panel sessions where you're discussing different topics, and I guess it's trying to broaden Treasury's scope, I guess, as to what they're looking at.
Well, I think certainly that the Treasury felt there was a lot to be learnt from the tax working group approach. That approach, of course, was to put together a panel of people who had different experiences, different expertise on taxation and taxation policy, and different practical experiences about implementing tax policy, dealing with tax policy. And I think they felt that process provided some useful lessons about how to approach the design and recommendations of policy. The difference with this approach, with this panel of course, is that while the tax working group was asked to produce a report for government, this external panel is not charged with that responsibility. It's Treasury's initiative to charge the Treasury, to put challenges to Treasury, and help test their assumptions, test their approach in the process of Treasury producing a report, their report, Treasury's report. So the panel won't be producing a report.
Okay, and so Treasury's report's coming out next year. So you're not making recommendations as such like the tax working group. So what is the panel looking at? Is Treasury coming to you and saying, hey guys, this is what we're thinking about, can you guys toss us around a couple of economists outside and tell us what you think? Is that how it goes?
Well, it's a bit like that, but of course Treasury have thought about how to run this process for quite some time, and they have brought together a panel of people who, there are people who've got academic backgrounds, there are people with more policy backgrounds or other sorts of backgrounds, different expertise on demography, demographics, expertise on the history of New Zealand public policy, and those sorts of, and on tax policy, government expenditure programs, pension programs, health policy experts. So they have asked this group to, some of the members of the panel are actually doing some background research and presenting papers at the panel sessions. Treasury staff themselves are presenting papers at the panel sessions.
Which you then test.
And then we discuss and we challenge and raise questions and raise issues for Treasury to think about, all as part of the input to their thinking about how to prepare and approach their report next year.
Right, so these long-term projections are basically showing the forecast costs for things like superannuation, healthcare, stuff like that. So how are you approaching that? So the big costs.
Right, well, I mean, the process is, I guess we're asking a range of questions. What do we think, and what does Treasury think, and what does the panel think are the key pressures on the long-term fiscal situation? And of course, some of the big issues that come up are what influence might demographic change have on the long-term fiscal position.
There were some quite fascinating numbers, and just from, I think, your paper introducing it was 5.1 people in 2010 aged 15 to 64 for every person aged 65 plus, whereas by 2060 the ratio will be 2 to 3.
Yes, and that's going to be that's not really news, but what is the panel felt fairly. I think the panel was of the view that definitely significant demographic change is taking place. It's not temporary. There is a change in the age profile of our population over the next 30, 40, 50 years, and it's not going to be temporary. It's not just the baby boom effect, post-war baby boom effect. It's a consequence of people living healthier lives, living longer. So it's a good news story, but it has implications for government's fiscal position in the future, or at least it could have. Likewise, improvements in health technology, growth in incomes, have effects on the demands for public services. So those are the sort of challenges that are emerging. So other questions are then, well, what sort of targets should the government be aspiring to? I mean, can it let these challenges be met by letting public debt rise, or should be targeting a particular level of debt? And so those are the sorts of questions that are being put to the panel, and background work is going on in that. And if there is a challenge, how should government, what are the options for government to address? What are the policy changes that it might think about? Where are the critical areas of policy? Is it in superannuation? Is it in health? Is it in tax policy? Those are the sort of questions.
Right, because there's talk about this 20% net debt target that the government's trying to get back to, I think by 2020 or 2030, something like that. And there's a bit of talk of maybe that's too high, perhaps, but I guess it's obviously not your job to recommend whether it's too high, but you are looking at things like that, though, aren't you?
Oh, well, that's right. Well, okay, if you go back to the earlier reports, there was a bit of attention, I think. A lot of the attention went on how the fiscal pressures would lead to the level of public debt, and I think there was a lot of focus on this spiralling debt.
Up to 200% of GDP or something.
In due course. But of course, what tends to happen is that governments react, or people react to that, and so there's a lot of uncertainty about where exactly public debt would go if policies were left unchanged. But it is a bit of a signal that change is probably necessary. But the approach that's been taken here is to say, well, it's not good for an economy to let its public debt rise too far. What should the government be targeting? And for illustrative purposes, some of the papers that were presented in the first session said, well, if it was 20%, as is the current target, what are the adjustments that would have to be made? Interestingly, the panel, some members of the panel felt, well, perhaps in the new environment, global environment, maybe even 20% is a bit high, maybe even lower debt targets, which of course would increase the challenge.
Which
so
Treasury is going to go away and look at, perhaps?
Well, Treasury will go away and think about that. And of course what they are already doing is saying, well, if the target was a higher debt level, of course the adjustments wouldn't be so challenging. But if they were lower debt targets, they would be more challenging.
We're talking about needing surpluses of about 2% of GDP over the next 10 years, I think.
If we were to keep to a 20% debt target, and of course it was lower, it would have to be higher. So Treasury will receive that feedback and look at that, and that ultimately, of course, that's a decision for government to decide on what sort of debt target and whether or not its current target's appropriate.
Right. So there's super. Obviously healthcare costs, the tax levels as well, because there's talk about Treasury perhaps underestimating the amount of investment income people are going to be earning, the older generations are going to be earning. That was quite interesting, I thought, in the paper.
Yes, there was an interesting piece of work discussed at the first panel session, asking the question, which I don't think has been really considered sufficiently in previous reports, is, well, what even for a given tax structure, what do we think the tax revenue would do as the population ages? And if you look at just income taxes and GST tax revenue, while the mix of tax revenue would likely change for various reasons, which I won't elaborate here, but the aggregate level of taxation, or at least the average tax rate, wouldn't change significantly. But in that discussion, the panel raised the question, well, but what about if there's greater increases in savings or more income from investment income, what might that do to the tax revenue? So that's one of the ways in which this process is working. The panel said, well, we think Treasury needs to look at that source of tax revenue more closely.
Right, and you've also, I think, asked them to go away and look at the way it might affect income inequality and stuff like that.
That's right. I mean, there are some concerns raised about the effect that increases in the distribution of income might affect the social fabric, if you like. Well, what implications might the long-term fiscal position have for income distribution? And is that going to be important? So exactly, those are the sort of questions that are being raised by the panel. And so what we'll be going through this process over a period of over 4 panel sessions, and in December we'll be holding a public conference where people will be welcome to come along and listen to the issues and participate in the debate. So the first panel session was really raising questions like, what is fiscal sustainability? Is it important for a well-performing economy? What are the sort of challenges that seem to be on the horizon? The second panel session was, well, focusing, in which we've just concluded, and we might talk about another time. Cool. The second panel session is focused on, well, if there are problems on the horizon, how might you go about evaluating policy options, really taking what we call a rational policy analysis approach, saying, well, governments have several objectives they want to achieve. How do different options for dealing with the long-term fiscal situation, how do they impinge on those objectives? And then in panel sessions 3 and 4, we'll look in more detail at some of the policy options around healthcare, pensions, taxation, and so on.
The big 3, and all the while Treasury's going to be going away and coming back with revised assumptions, I guess.
Well, they'll be working on those assumptions for their modelling, but also people will be working on background papers for discussion at these panel sessions, and those papers will look at some of the options. And already they're receiving feedback about some of the options to look at.
Political feedback, or?
No, sorry, from the panel.
Right.
Feedback from the panel. So, so you can see that what's interesting about this process, I think it's a way for Treasury to reveal their own thinking to a panel of people from different backgrounds, but also for the people on the panel to learn about how Treasury approaches these issues. And I think it's a nice process, and it's a way of getting different ways of thinking about these issues brought into the mix in the way in which, and then the way in which, or the mix that Treasury is using in coming to its own view about key policy issues. And
more transparent and more public with this seminar at the end, I guess.
That's right.
And then the report will be released early 2013.
Well, Treasury, this is an input to Treasury preparing its own report. They will publish a report sometime next year. So in 2013 is when they proposed it. But you're right, it is a more transparent approach, if you like, to the development of public policy. We're putting a lot of the background papers up on the website. We're putting a summary of each panel session, what are the issues that came up, just as we did with the tax working group process. And just as we did with the tax working group process, we're going to have a public conference in December, and anyone's welcome to register for that conference. So, and I hope lots of people do. It'll
Fantastic.
be a lot of fun.
I'll definitely be there, yeah.
Good.
So fantastic.
Excellent.
Well, we'll look forward to hearing what comes out of the next few panels. And obviously, yeah, we'll be at the
At
conference.
the conference.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Alex.
Okay.
I look forward to seeing you there.
Cool. Thanks, Bob.
Good.